Hello, everyone. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett, and welcome to Across the Sky, our national Lee Enterprises weather podcast. Lee Enterprises has print and digital news operations in more than 70 locations across the country, including at my home base in Richmond, Virginia. I'm joined by my meteorology colleagues from across the sky. We've got Matt Holler in Chicago, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, and my buddy at the Jersey Shore, Joe Martucci, with the Press of Atlantic City. Our guest this week is Dr. Douglas Casa at the University of Connecticut's Korey Stringer Institute, where they research and advocate for athletes at all levels regarding safety and performance. Basically, we're talking about football practice in the heat this week. For those of you not familiar, Korey Stringer was an offensive tackle for the Minnesota Vikings. He died from exertional heat stroke during the NFL training camp in August of 2001. He had played in 93 regular season games, and his family worked directly with Dr. Casa to develop the Institute in the years that followed. And he'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But I want each one of us to briefly talk about what we liked. I kind of liked the end when we had the all-important Gatorade versus water question. What are some of the things that you really took home from this discussion we had? Let's start with you, Joe.
The Gatorade versus water one's good. You didn't bring up Powerade though, Sean. You should have, power ranked the three.
I'm of old school. There is lemon, lime, and orange, and that is it. I am that Gen X dude.
Oh my God. Lemon lime is good. Lemon lime's good. So you're going to hear the word wet bulb globe temperature a couple of times here throughout the pod. So it's a measure of heat stress. I'll let him talk more about it, but it's very important. And, if you're in athletic training, you probably know what it is. If you're not, it's a newer concept that us meteorologists and those in the weather industry are trying to bring to light.
Yeah, and I think for me, the thing that stands out about this is everyone can relate to this because there's so many people involved with football, especially early on in the season, and are used to this heat. Even if you're not an athlete, there's so many people, the bands that go to the games, the cheerleaders, the fans. And there are a lot of games. I can think of some Texas football games in Austin, Texas. Usually that first game of the season, if it was a kickoff at 11 a.m. or 2:30, it's not just the players on the field that are feeling the heat, but the fans in the stands. So this is just so relevant to so many people in August and early September, because especially in the South and Southeast, where a lot of these heat-related deaths do occur with football. I mean, you can still have some really hot days, and this summer is a great example with all the heat advisories and heat warnings. It's been an extra hot summer, and so it's probably going to be an extra hot start to the football season as well.
And he talks too just about, the symptoms that you can expect if you are potentially coming on with heat exhaustion or heat stroke. But then he also goes into treatment and what they do on the field with some of these players if they are starting to experience some of those symptoms. So be on the lookout for that as well.
Yeah, very good information coming. So with that, let's get right to our conversation with Dr. Douglas Casa at the Korey Stringer Institute up at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Douglas Casa is a professor of kinesiology at the University of Connecticut and the CEO of the Korey Stringer Institute. And this time of year, August, with football practices underway ahead of the season, heat, of course, is top of mind. Casa's passion for this line of research began in 1985 when he suffered exertional heat stroke while running a 10K, thus motivating his career research, the study of exertional heat stroke, heat illnesses, hydration, and prevention of sudden death in sports. Dr. Casa, thank you for joining us on the Across the Sky podcast.
Honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's get right into this. Talk to me about this time of year, the risks to heat stroke, specifically with football players, what happened with Korey, and how this kind of worked into this broader institute that you developed.
Sure, yeah. As many people know, Korey Stringer passed away in 2001 from exertional heat stroke, the only NFL player to die during a practice or a conditioning session or a game in the 100-year history of the sport. And I assisted his widow during some legal proceedings that took place as an expert witness for the next 8 years. And Commissioner Goodell and his widow, Kelsey Stringer, reached out in 2009, asking if we want to host a lasting legacy for Korey, because they knew my expertise and my passion for the topic. And we opened our doors in 2010 We had 3 people when we opened our doors, and now we have 80 people who work at KSI. There's 25 staff and 55 volunteers, and we're focused on health and safety issues for the athlete, warfighter, and labor, and conduct research, do a lot of public health initiatives, advocacy, testing of individuals. So I've been able to serve a pretty wide audience.
All right, so let's step back a little bit to about what the conditions were like in this environment in terms of football practices and the like 20 years or so ago. Now a lot of this stuff is kind of intuitive. It's hot, you need to take it slow, you need to hydrate. But what other kinds of things were missing 20 years ago and we still need to improve on? I mean, I think you and I remember a time where we were just told it's hot, drink some water, keep going. Obviously, that's not the right answer. So talk a little bit about those things.
Sure. So we can put it into 3 buckets: things that prevent the heat stroke from happening in the first place, things you can do to recognize it as quickly as possible, and then things you would do to treat it if a heat stroke does present itself. So first, from the realm of prevention, there are kind of 5 big ticket items. One is heat acclimatization. That's the phasing in of activity across time in the first week or 2. So going a little lighter, doing, single day sessions, don't having successive days of 2-a-days phasing in equipment. It's important for your audience to know that almost all heat strokes, more than 80%, happen in the first week of activity when people are returning or doing something, whether it be military training, a person at a job working in the heat, or an athlete in football training. Second item is measuring the environmental conditions and making modifications to the work to rest ratios on more extreme days, having more breaks that are longer. Third item is cooling strategies, having cold, wet towels available during breaks, having shade available during breaks, or whatever else you can do to cool someone to limit the rise of their body temperature. Fourth is hydration. Having fluid available, not having to have official breaks to accessing fluid anytime you need it. Fifth is kind of individual factors when people are on certain medications, supplements, have had previous problems in the heat, recent illnesses or injuries where they've been away from sport, they put them at greater risk. So those are the buckets that kind of fall into the realm of prevention of heat stroke.
Dr. Costa, I want to go back, if that's okay, and talk some about environmental factors.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from what many would think, just simple heat index. I spoke with some trainers here in the Tulsa area, and they said that the wet bulb temperature was really something that they went off of when it comes to those environmental factors. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you monitor?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. So we do something called the WBGT, which is wet bulb globe temperature, which factors in like a bunch of different key environmental considerations. One is obviously the ambient temperature, the relative humidity, the radiant heat load, which is key because heat index is really limiting and should never be used in sports, because heat index by its when it was originally developed was done in the shade for people at rest. And that's just not relevant for an athlete who's exercising in the sun and doing intense exercise. So wet bulb globe temperature, 75% of the thermal load is the humidity, about 20% is the radiant heat load, 10% is the ambient conditions. It also factors in wind speed to some of those calculations, so that we set up the work to rest ratio guidelines based on the wet bulb globe temperature measures that we get. And it's also really important that you're measuring those on site and never, ever relying on weather station data that could be 20 miles away, because the artificial turf or the black track or the pavement of a tennis court, all of those surfaces are very, very, very different than what you would get from a local weather station.
Hey, Dr. Costa, I'm going to follow up on this because I really like using the wet bulb globe temperature, but then this is more of like from a societal perspective. The one issue I have with it, and reason why I don't know how far this is going to take off using this on a public basis, is simply because a lot of these temperatures are lower than the heat index or even the air temperature, depending on what it is. I mean, you have, I believe you would know better than I, but I believe when you're above 90, that's really significant. But someone might see 90 or 91 and think, it's not that bad.
Yes.
So, I see you laughing a little bit over there. So how do you kind of blend those two together and, go forward with this?
Yeah, that's a great point. If I started things all over again, I would have done a plus 40 correction factor for wet bulb temperature that just magically makes it higher, because you're totally right. 92 wet bulb globe temperature, you have to cancel all training in the military. Like, you'd be court-martialed if you continue activity. And that's, but 92, a person in Louisiana hears it and they're like, oh, this is the most mild day of the whole summer. Right. So, but yeah, so people in the medical field, the athletic trainers who are working at the high schools, they understand those measures. And they've proven to have great value for reducing heat illness load. And right now at the high school level, almost every high school in America now has a wet bulb globe temperature meter, which is really good in terms of progress. But I do get what you're saying related to the numbers not translating to the general society in terms of being as meaningful.
Yeah, and Doug, I think it's also just confusing for people because when we issue heat advisories and those excessive heat warnings, which have become quite common, particularly this summer, those are based on the feels like temperature, the heat index, which is just looking at temperature and humidity. So that's what people are most used to. I mean, at first, it was just getting people educated about what the feels like temperature really means and remembering that you have to include humidity. And so then you add in other factors and people get real confused and it goes beyond even what the National Weather Service is warning for. So for people that are not used to dealing with wet bulb temperature, it's good that people are especially those at high schools and at the training level, are educated on what that means. But for the general public, is there a particular feels like temperature or air temperature that should really start to raise kind of those alarm bells? Like, okay, this is a temperature where I do need to actually take extra precautions. When it comes to just looking at the feels like temperature, is there a threshold that people should really focus on for when it could potentially become dangerous for athletes?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's tough because I don't really think there's a great metric really for the public necessarily, because heat index completely useless. I mean, I can't tell you how useless it is. It doesn't take into account sun or the radiant heat load. So if you're in Phoenix in the middle of the day and you know what that feels like, you feel like you're going to literally cook or melt. That sun factor is not factored into heat index unless you're doing that very arbitrary plus 15 that OSHA or somebody puts on their website that you should add on a full sun day to the heat index measure. But that's completely arbitrary. So it's not really an objective measure. So it's a tough call in terms of, having these metrics, because heat index, like I said, is a shade measure at rest, and that's just not super useful for us. So we want something that really, humidity and the radiant effect of the sun directly are really the key factors that we want to have people consider.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really needs to be ratcheted up in terms of environmental and weather communications. I think we remember a time where we always would talk about, well, what is it in the shade and what is it in the sun? And we've kind of lost that in a lot of aspects in weather and environmental communications, that the sun matters, and it matters a lot in the summer. The sun is higher up in the sky. Your skin itself is going to be heated by the sun way more than it is in a December or January day. Could you speak a little bit about that more in terms of when we look at wet bulb globe temperature and we talk about the incoming solar or radiant, does that kind of fluctuate with seasonality in terms of sun angle, with cloud cover? A little, could you dive a little bit more into that?
Yeah, so the radiant heat load is not just the direct radiant heat load. It's also, you got to remember how much we get from the reflection. You're on a black surface or the turf surface. So a full sun day versus a full cloud day could mean artificial turf being 150 degrees versus 115 degrees. It can be very, very different in terms of what you're handling. And most people don't realize, you have 4 ways you can cool yourself: convection, conduction, radiation, and evaporation. 3 of those are completely dictated on how it relates to your skin temperature. So your skin temperature at rest is around 93 degrees. If it's higher than 93 ambient outside, you're absorbing heat from the environment via radiation, conduction, and convection. And the only way to cool yourself is with evaporation, and that's with the sweat droplet evaporating. But if you're in humid conditions like in the Southeast, where almost all of the heat stroke deaths take place in athletics, you have no ability to cool yourself, because if the sweat droplet doesn't evaporate, then you don't actually cool yourself at all. You're only losing fluid. So the radiant heat load is really, really critical, because one, you can absorb heat, but you're also getting the reflection from the surface that you're playing on. And that's why full sun versus full cloud has so much influence on the measures that we have and what influence it has for risk of heat illness.
Another thing about acclimatization, as you mentioned, most of these deaths and heat stroke, heat exhaustion, all of this tends to be in the Southeast. How much in terms of acclimatization do we see with regard to people in relatively cooler climates? Let's say in coastal Oregon or Washington or northern New England, where it doesn't get as hot in general. but they do get a locally hotter day. Just talk about how the body reacts if you live in a different climate, if you live in a northern climate versus a southern climate. How much does the body kind of acclimate over time, just climatologically?
Yeah, I mean, it takes about 7 to 10 days to get about 90% of the physiological changes associated with heat acclimatization, and it can happen in Massachusetts or Oregon or Louisiana. I mean, you just need a football player practicing in August and it's 86 degrees in Massachusetts instead of like 102 in Louisiana. They're still going to get heat acclimatized. I mean, they're still going to make those changes, those physiological changes. You get heat acclimatized if your body temperature is over 102 for about an hour of activity, and if that happens for 5, 6, 7 days out of a 10-day stretch. So you need to have that trigger. And for a football player to practice, especially any lineman, they're going to be over 102 for a couple hours of the practice session. So heat acclimatization can happen regardless of the climate you're in. It's happen a little bit faster if you're in a hot weather climate, because obviously you're going to get a little more hypothermia because of the environmental conditions, but it's going to happen everywhere. And that's why we work for heat acclimatization guidelines in all 50 states. We work for wet bulb globe temperature guidelines in all 50 states, because those are two separate things that people need to consider. The phasing in of activity across the first week is different than making modifications based on the environmental conditions.
For sure. All right. So when we come back on Across the Sky podcast, we're going to have more with Douglas Casa, specifically about football this time of year. So stay with us. And we're back with Dr. Douglas Casa from University of Connecticut's Korey Stringer Institute, talking about heat, sports, and especially football this time of year. The regular season kicking off very shortly, just another 2-3 weeks or so. Specifically, August, heat, football practice this time of year. We talked earlier in the podcast today about kind of working your way into it, starting off slow in the first few days of practice and then kind of building up as time goes on to get kind of acclimatized to the conditions. Talk a little bit about how, and some of this is intuitive, but extra padding, how much extra heat the body is generating when it is exerting itself versus taking it more slowly.
One of the first tricks we tell people is to get fit first before they worry about heat acclimatization. So if you can do conditioning, through the weeks in July when you're in no gear and you're not specifically doing football practices, you can help your conditioning. But then when the actual formal football practices start, we've made a lot of modifications to policy over the last 20 years. The NCAA has done it, the NFL, most state high school athletic associations have adopted it. And that is the first 5 or 6 days, there's no 2-a-day practices. You phase in the equipment. So the first 3 or 4 days, you might only have a helmet on. Then after those periods of times, you maybe add some shells, and then you can go to full gear maybe after a week. And then after the first week, you don't ever have 2-a-days on successive days. So there's all these modifications to intensity and duration and the general stress to the body over that first 7 to 10 days to really protect people. Because like I said, the first week they're at the greatest risk. So what can we do to decrease risk in that first week? And, slowly increasing the stress is one thing you can do.
About how much more body heat, if you can quantify this, is generated when you're exercising, at a level where you're doing rent sprints, when you're doing drills. Obviously, it means, again, some of this is intuitive, but is there a way to quantify how much more heat the body is generating? It's
a good question. So, I mean, the biggest factor that dictates the rate of rise of your body temperature is the intensity of the activity. So yes, if you can not do really intense conditioning sessions, having more breaks, that's going to decrease the intensity, especially in that first week. And the second biggest factor that drives your rate of rise of body temperature is the environmental conditions. So obviously on more extreme days, taking more breaks, trying to have practices during times of the day when it's not as extreme, having availability of shade during break periods. Those are just like kind of tools we have available to us to decrease that risk.
Doug, if someone wants, they want information from you about how to reduce their heat risk. Let's say it's a professional team, or we can even say it's a college team. How do they go about reaching out to you and what are your communications like with them?
So, yeah, I mean, I've worked with all 32 NFL teams, hundreds of college teams, some of the top pro teams around the world. I mean, people reach out to us directly at KSI. We consult with some of them. We give advice, more, quick advice, like in an hour phone call or with some others. So it all depends on the circumstances. We have a lot of people who've had problems in the heat in the past, and they come to us for testing so we can figure out their sweat rate and their sweat electrolyte concentrations and give them strategies. We've had people who've had heat strokes and who are unfortunately not treated properly and who did not recover properly, and they need help, maybe getting back to their sport or their job. So yeah, we have a lot of interactions with, organizations, governing bodies, but also the athletes themselves.
And it seems like a lot of people are reaching out to you and trying to become better informed about this. But my wonder is how many are really taking this seriously? And I think a lot of people might be listening to this podcast. It's like, I wonder if the school that my kids are going to are following these procedures. So how do you know if your school or your team is following these procedures? And how do we know that, people are really adopting this? Because it seems like there could be some that are like, I can take advantage. We'll start the 2 days a week earlier than all those other guys and feel like they get a competitive advantage that way. So I could also see this as a way, it's like, this is the way we're going to get ahead. But that seems like that'd be, of course, a dangerous decision to make. So how could someone be, really find out if their school is really following these procedures and is sticking to this plan?
Yeah, Matt, I'm so really happy you brought that up. So the biggest thing I would tell any parent in America of a high school athlete is make sure their high school has an athletic trainer. That's the licensed medical professional that takes care of medical conditions. About 2/3 of high schools in America right now have athletic trainers. But if their kid is playing a sport right now at a high school level, especially the higher risk sports like football, soccer, basketball, running, and really any sport, they should be concerned if they don't have an athletic trainer. Because if they don't have an athletic trainer, then the coach is going to decide if their kid lives or dies when there's a cardiac event, when there's a heat stroke, a sickling crisis, a head injury. And we don't want the coach deciding if your kid's going to live or die. So that's the most important thing I would tell any parent in America is make sure their high school has an athletic trainer there during all the practices and games. And that would be a great start because that athletic trainer is going to make sure they're meeting the state regulations for heat acclimatization, for wet bulb globe temperature guidelines, for work to rest ratios, for, pre-participation physicals. The athletic trainer is the steward, to make sure all those things are taking place. You don't want to rely on the athletic director or the coaches for medical care.
And Dr. Costa, this might be very kind of elementary, just taking it back kind of to basics. But if we have any students that are listening to this podcast right now, can you just give them some bullet points on things to be aware of that could be leading to heat exhaustion or heat stroke? Just a couple of things that they may, start to notice.
Sure, that's good. Yeah, about 50% of the cases of heat stroke have prodromal signs and symptoms, meaning they'll exhibit issues before the collapse. So it's important for two things. One, you could notice things early, but two, sometimes you can never notice things early. And the first indication there's a problem is they're collapsed in front of you, and we have to act quickly. But some common signs and symptoms, the biggest ones is for heat stroke to make it different than heat exhaustion. Remember, no one dies from heat exhaustion. People die from heat stroke. And the biggest difference between those two is central nervous system dysfunction, meaning in heat stroke, they might have confusion, combativeness, agitation, a lot of just not paying attention, saying irrational things. That's something that separates it from heat exhaustion. But then some of the common things would be like headache, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, lightheadedness. But those can exhibit themselves in both heat stroke and heat exhaustion. It's the central nervous system stuff that separates it. And also extreme body temperature at the time of collapse is a big difference. Heat strokes are 105 or 106 or greater at the time of collapse, where heat exhaustions will be in the 102 to 104 range. But obviously that athletic trainer would be doing the accurate core body temperature measure to know that they're dealing with a heat stroke.
About how long between the time that somebody starts to exhibit these symptoms of potential heat stroke before there is they collapse? So I'm assuming it runs the gamut that as soon as you recognize these symptoms, you need to act immediately. But can have these symptoms been known to go on 20, 40, 60 minutes before somebody collapses? I'm always trying to think in my head, these are the signs, this is how long I have, these are the actions that need to be taken.
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when I say collapse, that it doesn't necessarily reach the point of collapse for everybody. It might be someone, they walk back to the wrong huddle, or they're screaming at the coach and they would never normally do that, or they might be punching a teammate, or they might be just going to sit near the bleachers and they're incoherent, and they're still conscious though. So anything that's off like that, if someone's been doing intense exercise in the heat and you've ruled out that it's a cardiac event, we always tell people to assume it's heat stroke until proven otherwise. You have, from the moment it presents itself, we have 30 minutes to get their temperature under 104. if we want to assure survivability without long-term complications to damage to their organs. So if someone's starting at 108 or 109, which is typical starts for heat stroke, and you want to get them under 104, that's why almost every high school in America has cold water immersion tubs. Over 80% of high schools have them. All college football programs have them. All 32 NFL teams have them because cold water immersion has the best cooling rates. So if we can get someone in a tub after they show signs of heat stroke, you can get them under 104 within 15 to 20 minutes. And that's the window. And there's a concept called cool first, transport second. Even if there's an ambulance there, you don't put them in the ambulance. You finish cooling in the tub because that has the best cooling rates, and then you send them to the hospital.
And Doug, I wonder if you have any numbers on the number of heat strokes that are associated with sports, and then also the number of fatalities. Are there any specific numbers that are associated with it?
Yeah, so the National Catastrophic Center for Sports Injury Research that's centered at UNC Chapel Hill, that we partner with them on the exertional division here at KSI. We generally see for the high school level like 4 or 5 deaths a year on average if you took it over like a 10-year stretch. But obviously there's many hundreds of heat stroke that happen every single year at the high school level. Most of them are in either cross-country running or football, with football being the leading sport. The big thing is, like I mentioned before, someone can have a heat stroke and have permanent damage. Like they could have damage to their liver, their kidneys, their brain, their heart. So they might survive the heat stroke, so it doesn't get recorded as a death, but their life is never the same after. And that happens to most people who are not treated properly, have long-term or permanent complications.
Doug, we're going to wrap it on up, and we really appreciate all the time. But I got one last question for you here, a fun football question. So you got your master's degree from University of Florida, and then you got your PhD in exercise physiology from UConn. So who's going to have more football wins this season, UConn or Florida? It's a trickier question than people might think.
So it's a good question. My University of Florida, I'm going to guess, is going to have more. Obviously, a little more of a football tradition, but UConn had a decent season last year, hoping to, build back to where we were some years ago. But yeah, so UConn is my basketball school, and University of Florida my football school.
There you go.
That makes perfect sense.
You got something for the fall and the winter. You're good until March.
Yeah, my wife and I are alums of both schools, so we get to have an assortment of teams to cheer for.
That makes perfect sense, for sure. Oh, one more question before we sum up. Gatorade versus water. Man, I still hear this all the time. Does it really matter, or is just water just fine?
So in most circumstances, water is fine, but if you're doing more than an hour of activity and it's intense exercise in the heat, I would always encourage you to have sodium in the beverage because it helps with retention of fluid and it encourages the thirst mechanism. So someone will voluntarily drink a little more to minimize their dehydration. So if it's intense exercise in the heat, it's going to be a few hour practice. If it's a soldier, laborer, or an athlete, I do encourage some people to have some sodium in the beverage and to get some calories in the beverage.
Excellent. I get that all the time, so it's great hearing it right from you. Anything else you wanted to bring forward before we wrap up?
No, I think it's been good. I really appreciate this opportunity to get to another audience.
Thank you so much. Where can people online find out more about the work you're doing there at KSI?
Yeah, it's simple. KSI.uconn.edu. So UConn's UCONN.
Wonderful. Dr. Casa, thank you so much for joining us. Hope everybody stays safe. And remember, it's not just a little bit hot. It can be dangerous this time of year.
All right. Thank you.
Michael J. for Hope for the Warriors. Started back in 2006 at Camp Lejeune. Military families witnessing the effects of war on their loved ones. Now, almost 20 years later, they've aided over 53,000 service members, veterans, and families with confidential, high-quality behavioral health care services at little or no cost to post 9/11 vets and their families. Over 91% of every dollar donated goes directly to the programs. If you're as concerned about our heroes as I am, go to hopeforthewarriors.org.
Guys, for me, it's really amazing to see how things have changed regarding heat and football and practices, since the time I was in high school back in the 80s, showing my age, and to how things are handled now, especially as, unfortunately, we do see the weather tending to turn a little bit hotter. August has always been hot for sure, but man, we're not seeing the two-a-days as much. We're not seeing full pads as much anymore, because it's you don't want to think about especially kids going out there and truly suffering, or worse, dying from something that's very easily preventable. So very glad to have had Douglas on for today.
Yeah, totally. We did get to talk a lot about that wet bulb globe temperature, and just how important it is for so many in sports and even in the military. I liked how he brought that up too. At a certain time, military stops exercises as well, depending on the sunlight, how strong the sun is, the dew point, temperatures, etc. And he's definitely done this before. You could tell he's very well versed in this and what to let people know. So it was a nice tight podcast. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. We try to keep this one short for you, but there's a lot of info in there. But it was a nice short podcast for us as well.
The one thing that stands out to me is how he mentioned the importance of athletic trainers. And I do think they're a very overlooked person on these football teams because they have such an important role trying to look out for the athletes, because the coaches are all about winning. And the coach knows that he's going to lose his job if he doesn't win games. So he's all about, how can I make these guys better? How can we win games? And might, in the process of doing that, overlook the safety of the athletes. I mean, we certainly hope not, but we see how quickly a coach can be fired if they have one losing season even. So there's a lot of pressure on the coaches just to win. And so you need somebody there to say, wait a minute, it's not all about winning. We need to make sure these guys are safe, because this could impact the rest of their life. So I think the importance, and one thing that's got a little bit scary is that there are a lot of high schools that still don't have athletic trainers. You only talked about 2/3 of high schools even having athletic trainers. So I think there should be a real push to make sure that every school, even the small ones, have somebody who's really looking out for the safety of the athletes.
Yeah, and he was able to, I guess, for those who don't have those trainers, to give a little insight on what, you may be experiencing if you are coming on, or some symptoms you may be experiencing if you are coming on with a heat stroke or heat exhaustion. So good to hear from somebody, right from the source, I would say, because he sure is in the thick of it and he sure does know his stuff.
Yeah. And I also like this idea that I've become a little bit frustrated with the heat index and the feels like temperature. And Joe, I'm with you. If I could just turn a switch and go back in time, I would love to introduce the wet bulb globe. But as you alluded to here and earlier, it's, you hear 90 and it doesn't sound that bad, but a 90 wet bulb globe temperature, that's black flag conditions for the military. They're not going to have operations. And the other thing, I did not know this, that your skin temperature is 93. So that if you're outside and just the regular old temperature is 93, you're going to be taking on heat unless you were sweating like just crazy and losing heat that way. All right, with that, we'll wrap then for this week. In the coming few weeks, we've got some more really good topics. We're going to talk about those infamous bouncy houses and the weather. We're going to talk more about football and fantasy football. And we're also going to talk a little bit more about the deep oceans and the warming waters of the deep oceans as the climate warms, as we're getting into the core of hurricane season. But for all of my meteorology colleagues from across the sky, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, Matt Hollander in Chicago, and Joe Martucci at the New Jersey Shore, I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett at the Richmond Times-Dispatch. We'll talk with you next week.